Mastered economics cause you took yourself from squalor. Slave. Mastered academics cause your grace said you a scholar. Slave. Mastered Instagram cause you can instigate a follow. Shit. Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it?
Welcome back, everyone. Very few people have posted actual questions on the initial questions and reactions discussion board thread for this article. At the same time, I know this article is not an easy article because when I've taught it in the past, a lot of students have struggled with it. And based on the quiz grades for this article, I think you've been struggling with it as well. So what I'm going to do is repost a video that I made for a previous class in which I answered some of the questions they had about things they did not understand. It'll take you through some of the arguments, but also define some of the terms that maybe you were a little bit too nervous or shy about asking in the forum. And hopefully it'll help you understand the article a little bit more. Welcome back, everyone. What we're going to do right now is try and answer some of the questions you had about Joe Tompkins' article, a post-game interview for the Aegis, Richard Sherman, and the dialectical rhetoric of racial neoliberalism. And the first question, the question that many of you asked, was about racial neoliberalism and what that means. So let's start off with talking about neoliberalism. Now, I have a longer video that tries to explain some of this and that I did for a different class, and I'm going to post that for those of you who are interested. But let me give you the cliff notes on what neoliberalism is. First of all, neoliberalism is a term that a lot of people use different ways, so that's going to make it super confusing. But this article uses it in a way that is similar to Foucault and the way Michel Foucault uses it. So let me try and break this down. Liberalism has this idea that in the economy, in the professional world, in the business world, things are run a particular way, but in the private world, things are run very differently. So the decisions you make about things like faith, about what is right and wrong, about relationships, about love, about family, all of that sort of thing, those kinds of decisions are made in a different way than you would make decisions in terms of your business, in terms of profit, in terms of cost and benefit and those kinds of things. The things in the private sphere are decided differently. Under neoliberalism, the idea is that it's not decided differently, that everything is decided according to a business model. And it starts off being a cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost of being friends with you compared to the benefits? And that's how I would make the decision in terms of whether I'm friends with you. But it moves on to things like risk management and return on investment and an investment model and all those sorts of things. So it gets very complicated. But all of those things are applied to you and your private life and your person. So when it comes to understanding individuals and how they succeed in life, it's all about the decisions they've made. The idea being, and this extends beyond neoliberalism, but it is very much a foundation of neoliberalism. The idea being that no matter what you start with, if you are good and make the right kinds of decisions, you will succeed. And if you don't succeed, the reason you haven't succeeded is because you have not made the right decisions. In other words, everyone is an entrepreneur of their own life. It's your job to make the decisions, the right kind of decisions based on the resources you have in order to give yourself a successful and ultimately happy life. And if you don't have a successful and happy life, it's because you have made the wrong decisions. What this ultimately does, and we've talked about this before in other contexts, it eliminates any sort of systemic responsibility, any sort of hierarchies, or any inequality. It ignores those, or at least overshadows them, and focuses instead on the individual and the decisions they've made. So if we bring that into racial neoliberalism, what that does in terms of race is ignore any systemic racism and shoves that to the side, and instead focuses on the individual and the decisions they've made to overcome obstacles that are a result of their race. So in other words, Richard Sherman is successful, and we celebrate him because he made the right kinds of decisions to achieve success in spite of the obstacles. And what about all those other black men who do not achieve the same success that Richard Sherman does? Well, it's because it's their fault. They didn't make the right kinds of decisions. Ignoring, again, completely all the systemic racism that, especially right now, people are trying to highlight and bring out. So a raced entrepreneur is the same kind of thing. If we think about each individual as an entrepreneur of themselves, somebody who makes the right kinds of calculating decisions about their life in order to achieve success in spite of whatever obstacles they have, a raced entrepreneur is someone who specifically overcomes the obstacles related to their race and makes the right kinds of decisions to achieve success, not only professionally, but personally. This relates to the Africanized Horatio Alger. So Horatio Alger was actually a writer in the 1800s who wrote a series of books about boys who grew up poor, but because they pulled up their bootstraps and worked hard and did what they were supposed to do, were able to find success. They are not necessarily particularly literary books or books that are often studied in English courses. Instead, they were so common that people associated Horatio Alger with a particular idea of the American self-made man, the person who starts off with nothing, is able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work hard and make the right kinds of decisions and achieve success. A rags to riches story. And what that celebrates is the idea that anybody can find success in America, no matter what they start out with. Again, this is before the kind of neoliberalism that we're talking about that eventually incorporates the personal life. This is just the professional life. But it creates a myth that anybody can achieve success if they just put their mind to it, which is a load of crap. Different people, depending on where they are in society, face different levels of obstacles. And just because one person who is able to overcome extreme obstacles doesn't mean it's a level playing field for everyone. And so I think an Africanized Horatio Alger suggests that it's not just any kind of poor boy who grows up to find success. It's specifically an African American who grows up poor, but then eventually finds success later because they work hard and they make the right kinds of decisions. So these two go together, troglodyte and anachronism. So a troglodyte is somebody who specifically tries to be old-fashioned and resists progress. It can also refer to a caveman. So that's the kind of relationship that's being made here. If you call somebody a troglodyte or you say troglodyte racism, it's suggesting that that person or that kind of racism is intentionally trying to be old-fashioned. An anachronism is something that is out of time. So let me give you an example of an anachronism that you might be familiar with. If you were shooting a movie that is set in a medieval time and someone on set has a Starbucks cup, that is anachronistic. It doesn't belong there because Starbucks didn't exist in the medieval period. So it's something that is out of time. So if we call racism or a particular kind of racism anachronistic, or it is an anachronism, it is something that doesn't belong in this time period. It belongs to an earlier time period. Corporeality. That essentially refers to a body. So it is an adjective that refers to something that is bodily, something that belongs to a body. It's tough to describe this word without the context, so I'm going to look at the context it appears in the article, which happens to be a complex sentence. So I'm only going to look at the part of the sentence that has corporeality in it. How easily Essentializing narratives of black male corporeality can give way to racial frames that construct blackness as other. So essentializing is a word that refers to how you take something and you boil it down to something that is its essential part. When you're talking about essentializing a race of people, you essentialize who they are based on this color of their skin and say that is the most important part of their personality. So essentializing narratives of black male corporeality suggests that the most essential part of their existence in the world, in their bodies, is related to the color of their skin. And if that is the kind of narrative that you're creating, like the most essential part of them is the fact that they're black, it gives way to understanding them as different or other than you. And I think that's part of what this whole article is trying to argue. In this particular part, it is referring to how distinguishing Richard Sherman as somebody who achieved success in spite of the fact they were black can easily give way to racist comments about the fact that he is black, and how one slips into the other very easily. So corporeality here just refers to their body. Essentializing narratives about black male corporeality, talking about how black men exist in their bodies is directly related to the fact that they're black. Benign. This one's easy. Benign is harmless. So if you have a tumor and you get it tested to see if it's cancerous or benign, and it comes back that it's benign, it means it's harmless. It's just a bump inside of you and you don't have cancer, which is great. So if somebody else says something that's benign, it's harmless, it doesn't mean anything. If you have a benign ruler, it's a ruler who is harmless, who's not trying to hurt you, and is actually helpful. A lot of you asked about the conflict of interest section at the back. So let me talk about more generally why this appears in academic articles, and then more specifically why it might appear in this particular article. In general, you include a conflict of interest statement at the very end of the article to show that there's nothing that would lead you to certain conclusions other than the data itself. Here are two things in particular that would represent a conflict of interest. One, if you have a close relationship with the people you're writing about. And this sometimes happens. And people highlight the fact that they have a conflict of interest in order to show that they're not hiding it and to make people aware. Now, this doesn't happen very often. The more likely conflict of interest is funding sources. And so this is much more important when it comes to whether you're celebrating or critiquing an institution or an organization. If you've received money from that organization and your article just happens to be praising them for what they're done, that is a serious conflict of interest. It also comes up in the sciences. Drug companies will often fund research into certain drugs. And so the scientists who are doing that research have to declare the conflict of interest so that people know that they've received funding from those sources. Now, somebody asked, why can't people just lie? Well, here's the thing. Most of that stuff is easily discoverable. If you are interviewing somebody and they're related to you, all it takes is somebody to look into it for a couple of minutes using Google and they'll find it out. A lot of the funding that's handed out by companies is publicly recorded. So again, a quick Google search will reveal that you have received funding from the organization that you just have to be praising, or that you have received funding from an organization that's a competitor of the organization you're critiquing. So it's hard to get away with those lies. If you are caught lying like that, you could be fired from your job, you could lose funding, you could be blacklisted and not have your research published. So all of those things are there. And all you really have to do is declare a conflict of interest. And for the most part, journals will still accept your work. Now, for this particular article, it's hard to see where somebody would actually have a conflict of interest unless Joe Tompkins happened to be related to Richard Sherman, which he is not. But this journal does publish articles about sports organizations. And sports organizations do fund academic research sometimes. It can be a tax break. It can give them a tax break. So that does sometimes happen. So some articles will have to declare a conflict of interest in the journal. And so it's the journal's policy to force all authors of articles that are published in this journal to make a conflict of interest statement. So someone asked, why would this author focus on Sherman in a post-racial era? And I think this represents partially a misunderstanding of what Tompkins is talking about in terms of the post-racial era and why Tompkins is talking about Sherman in the first place. So let's talk about the post-racial era. The post-racial era that Tompkins refers to is the way some people understood the United States to be past issues of race because President Barack Obama was elected as president, the first black man elected as president. Of course, that was a smokescreen because most people who used the term post-racial era were white people who felt like they didn't have to talk about race anymore. And I think what Tompkins tries to bring out in this article is the different ways of talking about race and how they've developed through the last 50 years or so. So a post-racial era is an era where we talk about race as if we're past it and racism doesn't exist anymore. And by the time he's writing this article in 2016, and by the time, even when Richard Sherman is giving his interview, that has passed. And we now understand that race is actually still an issue. And we're not trying to feed that narrative about living in a post-racial era. So in other words, it's not a post-racial era anymore. It actually never really was a post-racial era in the same way we're not in a post-feminist era. Post-feminist is an idea that people have. And why talk about Richard Sherman then? Especially because he uses words like thug to promote himself. I think the reason you talk about Richard Sherman is partly because he exists and it was a big cultural event. People talked about it. Lots of people talked about it. And people wrote things about it. And if you're an academic, anytime something happens, somebody's going to want to study it. And this is a case of that. But I think it's more than that. I think this particular instance gives us a way of seeing how the media and people, public figures, talk about race and how it relates to neoliberalism. And I think Sherman gives us a way of talking about it. I don't think Tompkins likes it. I think that's pretty clear by the very end, that he is critiquing this way of talking about race. And so the reason you talk about Richard Sherman is because it's an accessible example to talk about a larger trend that is problematic. And the last thing is memes. Someone suggested that they were surprised that somebody talked about a meme in an academic paper, and why would somebody do that? And I think it relates partially to what I was just talking about. If it exists, somebody, an academic somewhere, is going to want to study it. And memes exist, so people want to study them. This is the meme that is referenced here. So why does Tompkins use this meme in particular? Tompkins uses this meme in conjunction with what reporters and television personalities say about Sherman, particularly how his education is evidence that he is not a thug, right? That his education goes against this idea. So he's not using the meme as his only source of evidence. It adds to an idea that this concept of creating a dichotomy between a thug and an educated black man exists, and it permeates different levels of culture. There's media where you have sports broadcasters and news media, but there's also people creating memes and circulating them. So that idea is consistent through both of those levels of culture. But beyond this, talking about memes is something that lots of academics do. A quick search reveals 2 books on memes, academic books on memes, that are available through the UBC library. And this search took me 5 minutes, and I stopped at 2. If I were to dig a little bit more, I know I would find more. There are people who talk about how memes exist and how they circulate, the kinds of ideas that come from memes, where they originate, how often they use, and how it's related to public events. In this case, the Make America Meme Again particularly talks about how the alt-right uses memes to circulate messages that are very conservative. So all of that exists, and somebody's going to study it. It's not necessarily that you take the information in the meme as reliable. It's that you study how memes happen, how they're shared, and how they impact the broader conversation about something. Tompkins isn't necessarily doing that. He's using a meme to show that this particular idea didn't just exist in media figures saying it, the idea specifically that because Sherman's educated, he's not a thug, but also showed that it permeated down to lower levels of culture or circulation of culture through memes. I think this is an important lesson to learn about academics, that if it exists, it's going to be studied, and that it might reveal valuable knowledge. This whole course is on celebrity studies, and many of my colleagues will look at that and say, why do you study celebrities? What's the point of studying celebrities? Why bother? They don't present reliable information. They don't tell us anything new. They're just exaggerated and superficial. And I hope that by reading these articles, you see that is not the case, that you can see a lot of different things through studying celebrities and celebrity culture. In the same way that I would argue you can see lots of different things by studying memes and the way they circulate. All right, let's have a look at the discussion question I'm going to ask you to talk about in the discussion boards. Tompkins focuses on one celebrity and one event in the life of that celebrity as a way of exploring a broader trend. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this approach? Now, the reason I picked this question is because I'm essentially asking you to do exactly that kind of thing in your final essay. Pick one celebrity or one event and use that as a way of exploring a broader trend. So I want you to think about the way Tompkins does it, and think about the advantages and disadvantages, what the limits are of doing this kind of study, not only in what Tompkins has done, but more broadly. And maybe that will help you understand the approach to the essay that you have to write. All right, that is all I have for now. Have a lovely day.
Look at all these slaves.